All right, in section 1.3, we start getting into a couple formulas in geometry. The first one is the midpoint formula. Our essential question is, how do you find the midpoint of a segment? Starting with definitions, the midpoint is the point that divides a line segment into two congruent segments. So in your picture at the left, I want you to add a little bit. Let's call this point P and the other endpoint point Q. And we're going to put a point in between them and call that point A. So if A is the midpoint, which is what we want to draw, the midpoint forms two congruent segments, which means that the left side and the right side have to be the same. So we're going to mark them with those hash marks. So what we would say about this is that A is the midpoint. And I'm going to abbreviate that, MDPT, for midpoint. So A is the midpoint of segment PQ. We would also say that the distance from P to A is equal to the distance from A to Q. And this has an @ symbol. It should be a congruent symbol. And we would say segment PA is congruent to segment AQ. So if A is the midpoint, all those things are true. A segment bisector is a point, ray, line segment, or plane that intersects the segment at its midpoint. So in our picture, let's add some points. Let's call this point X, point M, point N, and then in the middle we'll call this point W. Okay, and then if we want to show that this is a bisector goes through the midpoint, which would mean that each part would have to be congruent. So we'd have to put hash marks like that. So this is what the picture of a bisector would look like. So we would say ray XW bisects segment MN at point W. And we also could say that W is the midpoint of segment MN the length from N to W plus the length from W to N is equal to the length from M to N. We could also say MW equals WN. And lastly, this should say congruent. Segment MW is congruent to segment WN. So segment bisector is using the midpoint. Then we have a couple examples. Example 1 says find the lengths. We want to find the length of RS. So RS is the entire length. And notice that these hash marks mean that they're equal. So this would be 21.7 as well. So RS is equal to RT plus TS. And we can see that RT is 21.7. We also know that TS is 21.7. So when we add them up, we would get RS equals 43.4. Okay, I'm going to skip the checkpoint just to save time. The checkpoint's the same as the example we just did. I'm going to slide down to example 2. So point C is the midpoint. What that means is that each side is congruent. So if C is the midpoint of segment BD, find the length of segment BC. So if it is the midpoint, that means that each part, BC and CD, have to be equal. So you can see that BC is 3x minus 2. And CD is 2x plus 3. So what we're going to have to do is we're going to find what x is and then plug x in to find the length of segment BC. So we have to move all the x's in the same side. So let's get rid of this positive 2x by subtracting 2x from both sides. We get x minus 2 equals 3. Get rid of the minus 2. And we get x equals 5. So that's the number we're going to use. So we want to find BC. BC is 3x minus 2. So BC is really 3 times 5 minus 2. So what is 3 times 5 minus 2? 15 minus 2 is 13. So how long is segment BC? It is 13. All right, and then for the sake of time, I'm actually going to skip checkpoint 2 because it's the same as the example we just did, and we're going to move down to the formula. So midpoint formula. I'm going to label these endpoints A and B. All right, and A has the coordinates x1, y1, and B has the coordinates x2, y2. Okay? And to find the midpoint when we have coordinates, what we're going to do is take the x values and add them up and divide by 2. And then take the y values, add them up and divide by 2. And that's going to give us our midpoint. And the midpoint's going to be an x and a y. So for example, the endpoints of segment PR are -2, 5 and 4, 3. Find the coordinates of the midpoint. So we have x1, y1, and x2, y2. So if we want to find the midpoint, M, we're going to take the x's and add them up and put them over 2. We're going to take the y's and add them up and put them over 2. So the midpoint is -2 plus 4 divided by 2, which would be 2 over 2. And 5 plus 3 is 8. So 8 over 2. The midpoint is at 1, 4. And then we have example 4, which I believe is our last example. And this one can be tricky because they give us the midpoint for this one and we want to find the endpoint. So if they ask you to find the endpoint, we're going to start with this formula. Midpoint equals x1 plus x2 divided by 2, y1 plus y2 divided by 2. So you start with your formula. And right now we know what the midpoint is. They tell us the midpoint is 3, 4. They tell us that one endpoint, let me change colors. One endpoint, so I'm going to call this x1, y1. One endpoint is 1, 6. So we can plug that in. So we would have 1 plus x2 over 2, and then 6 plus y2 divided by 2. Okay, so the things we're missing are x2 and y2. So what we have to do is solve for those. So you're going to take the x portion. I'm going to use a highlighter. So take the x portion of each side and set them equal to each other. So we're going to get 3, I need to change that. 3 equals 1 plus x2 divided by 2. And then we're going to take the y portion and write an equation. 4 equals 6 plus y2 divided by 2. And we're going to solve these two equations. So to find x2, to get rid of that divide by 2, it's times 2. And we get 6 equals 1 plus x2. How do you get the x alone? Minus 1. So 5 equals x2. Now we want to solve for y2. So we times by 2. We get 8 equals 6 plus y2. How to get rid of the positive 6? So we don't want that. You subtract 6. And we get 2 equals y2. So what is the end point? The end point is at 5, 2. Okay, and there actually is another way you could do this. Let me grab a highlighter. Let's do a red highlighter. So I like to think of it as if one endpoint is at 1, to go from 1 to the middle, so from 1 to 3, you go up 2, correct? So that's halfway there going up 2. So if up 2 is halfway there, the other half is up 2 more. So what is 2 more than 3? 5. Okay, and then look at your y's. If you start at 6 and you go to 4, from 6 to 4, what are you doing? You're going down 2. So if halfway is down 2, the other half is down 2 more. So what's 4 down 2 more? 4 down 2 more is 2. So that's another way you could do that. Then the last two checkpoints, I'm going to skip those for right now. We might come back to them, but these are the exact same types of problems that we did in these examples.